Hi there, and welcome to our Slate demo series. Today is part 2 of 3 on swipe tracking in Slate. If you attended part 1, that was all focusing on entities, which is the foundation of this practice. But today we're going to be digging into our form configurations. Before we go any further, let me introduce myself. My name is Courtney Mumma, and I am the Assistant Director of Student Success Implementations here at Carnegie. I have about 6 years of Slate experience. I started as a Slate captain at a small art college in Portland, Oregon. And then I spent 2 years as a client support engineer at Technolutions. And then I've been enjoying the rest of my time here at Carnegie in this role. And I am the confident and enthusiastic thrill seeker. As a reminder, today's goal, part 2 of 3 on swipe tracking in Slate. And today we're going to deep dive into the form configurations. And what that means is that we are going to break down the 3 forms. We are also going to talk about the necessary merge fields for our query string parameters. And at the very end, we'll talk about our third and final part to this 3-part series and what you can expect from that. So let's dig into these 3 forms. The very first form, if you remember from part 1, is the student submitting form. This is what's going to show up to students at the location where the swipe tracking is occurring. They're going to swipe their card, their student ID number is going to populate into that ID number field, and that is a mapped field. We're going to look at that in just a second, but this is important. We only have one mapped field on this initial one. This initial form is the start of the process, and we don't want these to be entity scoped yet, because every submission of this form, if we're mapping our entity scope fields, will create duplicate rows. So we definitely don't want that. So keep in mind what is mapped and what's not mapped. ID number is mapped, our status is unmapped, and then our refer or our form is an unmapped field as well. Form number 2, this is where we get into our mapping. This is one of 2 auto-submitting forms. I'll show you that script once we get there as well. But we are indeed mapping student ID, just like we were on form number 1. And now we are mapping our entity scoped status field for checked in or checked out. We are mapping our form field or our referrer field. And then we're also populating a term field. This is helpful for querying information and time spent at a certain study hall, for example, across a term. We can use that just kind of in your aggregate data. Students don't need to fill it out, so we can just populate it on our form 2. We can also populate it on our form 3, which is our checked out form. The only difference between checked out and checked in is a unique entity quid. As I mentioned earlier, our process is to create a new entity row when somebody is checking in. And then in order to prevent multiple entity row creations, we need to match upon that checked in row for our checked out row. So that is where our unique entity quid is coming into play. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at these specific forms and dig into some of the configurations in each one. So this is our first form, our library study hall, the initial form. The registrant count on this should be double of what the checked out and checked in forms are. So as you practice and as you use this in your institution, you'll notice that as a trend. But let's come over into our edit form. And in here, again, mapped. The only mapped field in here. And then we have our status field unmapped. We do not have this looking like this. This is not the configuration that we want on our first form. This is the configuration on form 2 and 3, but not on the first one. And then our refer fields is actually using a calculation formula in the edit properties, which I'll show in just a second, to pull in the title of the form itself. This is especially helpful if this process is supporting multiple locations, so library study hall versus rec center checking in and checking out, residence hall checking in and checking out, all of that kind of stuff. This calculation formula makes it so that you don't have to manually code that on every single form, so they can do it for you. So let's take a look at these edit properties. First thing is scope. This is going to be a person scoped form. Our entity is person scoped. And so we want to make sure that we're updating the correct records, which are person records. We do want this to be set to multiple because student athletes, special populations, they should be filling out this form multiple times. So do yourself a favor and make sure that that is selected before you start testing. And then we also have unsafe selected. For student success, we use applications in a handful of different ways, like onboarding. And so we don't want an active application to hinder the process of our study hall tracking. And so this form can be unsafe. If you're unfamiliar with unsafe versus safe, in a nutshell, Slate protects application scoped person data at the highest level. And so if a record has an active application, any person scoped fields, any person scoped forms simply will not store data on that record if there's an active application because they don't want to mess up the student submitted application data. For this process, we don't need to worry about that too terribly much. And so we can check it off as unsafe. The final setting here is our security. We are allowing secure link login filters because we know who these students are. They are signing in with their student ID, they're swiping that card. This is a student success instance, and so the assumption is that those records already exist within Slate. So we don't want to create new records from this process. So we select allow secure link login. This also gives us the ability to join to the person base, which is really important for our query stringing that we're going to do in just a second. Next tab is that merge field that I was talking about earlier. So we're joining to the form and then populating the form title. All this is this library, study hall, rec center, login, whatever it is, to give you that form title that you then put in a calculation formula here. So it's dynamic based on the form that you're in. These settings on the general tab are going to be consistent across this form, form number 2, and form number 3. So just make sure that you're familiar with this configuration. Okay, on to number 2, our checked in form. This checked in form is also person scoped, has all of those same configurations, but this is where we're actually starting to map those entity fields. So to dig into that a little further, we have our person scoped student ID. This is what we're using for matching upon student records. And now here is where we are mapping our entity fields. So swipe tracking status, and then we have our form field or our refer field, and then we have term. And you can see here that term is being populated in a similar way that form was on the first one. So let's take a look at our merge fields. And this is my preferred way of storing term information. In the implementations that I've done, I highly recommend having categories on your terms so that you don't have to update every query, every report, every form to look at the current term. So fall 24, summer 25, et cetera, et cetera. You just need to add a category to those prompts. And I'll bring that over here so that you can look at what is the current term, and I want to populate that value. I also have this on upcoming and then the most recently past one as well. For ease of reporting, highly recommend using categories on your term prompts if you're not already, because it makes it easier and less maintenance to remember where everything is. You just have to update the categories as your terms roll over. So that's what this export is doing. We have an independent subquery to prompt. We are filtering on the category of current, and then we're exporting that export value into our term field. So that's form number 2. Let's take a look at form number 3. It is basically the same as form number 2, with the exception of that matching criteria. Again, we don't want multiple entity rows to be submitted every time this process starts, because then we don't have a consistent checked in, checked out kind of process. So we want to match upon our previous entity rows in order to update information that was previously submitted. Let's dig into the auto submission part of this form, because I think that is one of the coolest parts. If I click into this instruction block, head into the source, you can change the text however you need it to be. But in this instruction block, we have an ID of countdown, and this pairs with our edit scripts and styles. We have a script running on this form as well. To walk us through this very top one is hiding the submit button. We don't want students to be able to submit. We want this to be an auto submitting form. And then we have our ID of countdown, which corresponds to our instruction block. And what it's doing is saying, I'm saving the response for how many time left, where we get to decide how many seconds it takes for this to submit. I think the standard is 3. We need to have at least 3 seconds for all of the form fields to populate in Slate to recognize it as a form submission. And so it'll say saving response 3, 2, 1. The time left is being decided down here by how quickly it goes, and then seconds. And then once the time left is less than or equal to 0, then we are going to find that default button that we initially hid and trigger click in order to submit this button. I'll keep this up here for a second if you want to take a screenshot. This is so helpful for auto submitting forms. And this is going to be the same script that is on our checked in and checked out forms. Okay, how are these fields being populated? I'm so glad you asked. That is all on our form number 1. So coming back to that initial form, library study hall, we're going to go over to our communications. You can see that we have 2 redirects, one for checked in and one for checked out. I'm going to focus on checked out for this example because it has that extra entity matching field, but know that everything on checked out exists within checked in except for that single field. I want to come over to edit mailing. One thing about redirects is that they do have to be on a confirmation page. If they're on any other type of mailing, then that redirect won't occur. So you just want to make sure that you have the group as a confirmation page. Then let's take a look at our query strings in here. First things first, this is our redirect script. What that means is that when you get to that landing page after the initial submission, Slate looks at this and then redirects you somewhere else. So to break this down, this is our checked out form. This is just the URL for checked out here. Then we want to say, and the person equals GUID. I'm going to show you these merge fields in just a second. The student ID equals the student ID field or the SID. And then we're going to set our statuses. So our sys entity field of status for our out form, we want it to be out. For our in form, it would be in. And then our form is form. And then this is that unique matching criteria. So our sys entity ID is this form field here. So we're saying, and this field equals whatever our eGUID or entity GUID is. So this is a configuration for both of the redirects. You just want to make sure that all of the fields that you have on either your checked in or checked out forms is accounted for within your redirect because that's how those fields are going to be populated. So if I cancel out of here, let's go look at those merge fields. So in edit conditions, we first join a person because we need some person scoped information. We need the GUID, we need the student ID, but you can just from the form itself, export the refer, I changed this to form, and that's what stores the value as library study hall versus any of the other locations. And then we're exporting the person GUID. Again, we want to match upon our person records. Same thing with our student ID. We're pulling in our student ID, giving them easier export names for our redirect. And then we have to account for our status. And so our checked in or checked out. The reason why I have it in a subquery export is because I want to filter for the status being checked in or out. For this one is checked out. And then I have a literal here for our GUID of that prompt. So what that looks like here, here's my swipe tracking status prompt key. And this is the GUID of checked out. Anytime you're query stringing for prompt-driven fields, I highly recommend that you're using the GUID. Otherwise, you can get some inconsistent results with just the values. And so that is why in here we have the literal with that GUID for out when the status is checked out. The same process exists on checked in, just with that in that other GUID. Next up, we have our entity GUID. And to get our entity GUID, we want to make sure that we are evaluating the most recent submission of this form. So for example, for Quinn, I only want to evaluate the most recently submitted one because that, by assumption, should be your checked in status. So in order to do that, we do a subquery base join. And usually this is a red flag. I promise in this case it is not. You're going to join to your swipe tracking from your person join. And then you are going to add a sort for the created date. And then you're going to make this descending. And then you're going to choose your base as person and swipe tracking. This configuration ensures that you have a one-to-one relationship based on our row offset to the most recently created row. Again, the assumption is that the most recently created row is that checked in row, and we want to update that to be checked out on this redirect. Once you have your join, looks like this, you're going to export the entity GUID from that join, and that is going to be your eGUID. And that is what populates within your query string parameter here. So our matching criteria is entity GUID. And those are the steps for this form configuration to occur. Students go to first page, they submit checked in or checked out. Our auto submitting form takes them to the next place that they need to be in order for those fields to be submitted. And then that is the process thereof. Let's take a look at what we have coming up for part 3. Part 3 is going to be querying on all of this information and how to account for admin updates. We know students are typically going from one thing to another pretty quickly, and they can tend to forget to check out. So how do we account for that in this process so that we can see total numbers? Next time, we're going to talk about how to get cumulative hours per term, per the last 7 days, and then how to also account for them per row. So come with your best configurable joins hat on for our next training next month. And if you have any questions about this process, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to discuss it more. Thanks, everybody, and see you next time.